John chapter 18, starting in verse 39. This is Pilate, just after he had told Jesus that he found no guilt, told the Jews that he found no guilt in Jesus. And he says in verse 39, "But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold, the man." When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar's. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat him down at the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So they delivered him over to be crucified. Well, today in our passage, it marks the final stage of this trial of Jesus. We talked about these 3 stages where he's unjustly convicted and sentenced to be crucified. And from the very start of this trial, right, it's been a railroad job, hasn't it? It has just been a mess. And it should never be a trial at all. But it also has demonstrated throughout this trial the authority of God and why he alone is trustworthy. This trial began with an interrogation. A couple weeks ago we looked at this, right? Interrogation by Annas and the Jews, the Jewish leadership, where Jesus shows his word as authoritative and trustworthy. And then last week as we looked, he was handed over to the Romans, to Pilate, who was the governor there, the civil authority. And he was questioned by Pilate. And here Jesus shows that God's kingdom is the authority worth trusting over any earthly power. Now today this trial shifts again, and it actually bounces around as it comes to this conviction and the sentencing of Jesus. It bounces around between the Jews and Pilate, and really it gets chaotic. And what's happening here, and as I've read it, probably you thought it seems a little chaotic. And as we look at our passage, I want you to notice a couple things. First of all, I want you to notice how much both Pilate and the Jews are trying to manipulate what is happening and what is going to happen. And they're trying to manipulate it to their own agenda. But I also want you to notice how God's work and God's ways reign throughout all of this. Now, as we noted last week, Pilate, he was the Roman governor. He's a civil authority. But we also noted last week that Pilate was a pretty weak guy, a pretty weak leader. And he was just trying to keep the peace, right? And he wanted to keep his own reputation clean and come out of there clean and with his job and with his power and his cushy position, right? And after he questions Jesus, right, he declares that he finds no guilt in Jesus. And that's kind of where we left off. And he's reluctant to yield to these Jewish leaders' calls for Jesus to be crucified, that Jesus would be killed. So today, what happens, and we open with Pilate, is he tries to get away from this. He's trying everything he can to get away from Jesus and making a decision on Jesus. He wants to keep his hands clean again. And we see this 4 different times in our passage today, how Pilate tries to keep himself clean. Yet, even in all these attempts, he ends up in the end sentencing Jesus to death and crucifixion. So he ends up doing what he didn't want to do. So as we look at our passage, first we see in verse 39 that Pilate appeals to this Jewish custom. Now, this isn't the law. This was a custom that had started some years prior to this, where during the Passover season, the Romans would try to appease the Jews and let them release one prisoner, kind of as an act of mercy, I guess. And so Pilate gives them a choice. And it doesn't necessarily say that he gives them the choice here in John, but we see in the other Gospels how he presents 2 men before them, Jesus and this guy Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a bad guy. He was a very bad guy. So Pilate, in having these 2 prisoners, is basically trying to give them no choice at all. Of course, they're going to want to see Barabbas punished and set Jesus free. So that's what Pilate's thinking is here. But Barabbas, again, is a bad guy. He's an insurrectionist, which means he's a rebel against Rome. He's a murderer, and he's a thief, is what we learn about Barabbas. So the Romans didn't like this guy. They didn't want him around. But the Jews didn't want him around either, because he was bringing heat from the Romans on them. So he's like, this is a no-brainer, right? So I'm going to give you these. So you want somebody released, who are you going to release? And to his astonishment, the Jewish leaders, they work up the crowd, and they say, we want Barabbas released, crucify Jesus. So this hatred for Jesus is coming out, right, in all that's going. And so foiled in this attempt to release Jesus, Pilate goes a different route, another tactic to try to appease the Jews. Look at chapter 19, what happens at the start. Here's what Pilate's thinking. Perhaps if I punish Jesus, if I make him hurt, it makes it look like we did something to him. And maybe the Jews will take that and say, all right, at least you beat him up and you put him in his place, and that'll be okay, and they'll have some mercy, and I won't have to do anything with Jesus. So it says Pilate took Jesus and he flogged him. Now, flogging was horrible. In fact, many prisoners during flogging would die. They wouldn't even survive flogging. What flogging was, they had this whip with leather strips, and embedded in the leather strips were pieces of bone and rocks. So when you would whip somebody with this, it would tear strips of flesh off of their back and just tear them open every time it hit. And so that's what they do to Jesus. So imagine this, right? And then it says they mock and humiliate them. Jesus, they make a crown of thorns and put it on his head. So now he's bleeding from that. And they put a purple robe, which means royalty, on him. And then they start hitting him, right? So imagine this. And Pilate says, all right, this is good. So he brings Jesus up in front of the people. Imagine this gruesome scene of Jesus in front of the people, just beaten and bloodied to a pulp, you know? And certainly the leaders would think it's punishment enough. So, verse 5, he brings Jesus out, coming out, and he's wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate says to them, behold the man. And instead of having pity, the chief priests take it up a notch, right? And they cry out even louder, crucify him, crucify him. Yes, take it further, right? And Pilate's astonished. So, you know what he says? He says, well, then take him yourself and crucify him if you hate him so much, basically. I don't want anything to do with it. So he passes them back on them. And then what happens next, actually, John doesn't really talk about, but it's another attempt, when Pilate says take him back, another attempt to wash his hands clean of this, is that they end up sending him to Herod. Herod was the Roman tetrarch, which means he was a Jewish man, but basically he was loyal to Rome, and Rome kind of put him over there over civil issues and things. So they send him to Herod, and Herod ends up saying, I'm not dealing with this. He doesn't want to be blamed either, so he sends him back to Pilate, right? And so he comes back to Pilate, and Pilate brings him before the people, says, listen, there's no guilt. Even Herod wouldn't do anything against this guy. There's no guilt against Jesus. And the Jews answered him in verse 7 and says, well, we have a law. And according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. And it's interesting because now the Jews are changing their argument. You remember up to this point when they first brought him to Pilate, last week we saw that they painted him as the king of the Jews, a threat to Rome because he's a political problem. Well, that didn't work at the time. So now they're trying a different tactic and they're saying he's a religious problem because they're trying every angle to get rid of Jesus here. And so they're saying, well, he's this religious problem, and he made himself out to be the Son of God. And when Pilate hears this, verse 8 says he was even more afraid. You know what Pilate's afraid of? He's starting to think, well, if this guy really is the son of their God, if I do anything to him, I could really be in trouble. So he's like, man, I don't want to do anything at all. And on top of that, if he convicts Jesus, Matthew talks about that his wife had a dream about Jesus. God gave his wife a dream about Jesus. And Pilate's wife comes to Pilate during this time, in the midst of this trial, and says, listen, get away from this guy. Have nothing to do with him. Anything you do in this is going to be trouble. So Pilate doesn't want to do anything here, right? And so Pilate brings Jesus inside, and he says, I'm going to make a personal appeal to him. And this is the fourth way he tries to get out of it. He says, maybe if just Jesus and I talk, I can convince him. And so he starts asking him, small talk. Where are you from? Jesus doesn't say anything, which kind of is a fulfillment of prophecy. But then Pilate starts getting angry about that because he's like, don't you understand that I have the authority to free you? You can help yourself out. If you don't help yourself out, I also have the authority to crucify you. And that's when Jesus does open his mouth because he says, you don't have any authority except the authority that's given to you from above. And Jesus just talked about above, right? Where he says, my kingdom is not of the world, not of this world. It comes from above. So Jesus is talking about his kingdom. So he says, you wouldn't have any authority unless I gave you authority. So you really have no authority. And this is where Pilate's like, man, this is getting bad. And then he tells Pilate, although Pilate won't be held blameless in this, in what's going to happen with Jesus, the Jews, the ones who brought him to Pilate, will bear more of the guilt or bear a greater guilt because they should know better. Pilate doesn't know any better. And then, so then it says Pilate wants no part of this. From this point forward, he wants to do everything he is to release Jesus. But the Jews continue, and they realize that Pilate's kind of wavering, so they're going to try to talk him into it and get their way, right? And they said, if you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend, because how would you want another king but Caesar? So now they go back to the king, the political argument, right? And they're trying to bully Pilate, and they say, if you don't release him, we're going to tell Caesar, and he's going to remove you. He'll probably kill you because you're letting all this unrest happen. So now Pilate's a little bit more afraid, right? And he sees no way out, though, because he's being bullied. So he brings Jesus out, and he places him up on this judgment seat. And this judgment seat was this seat that somebody was sentenced on, and it was up these steps in front of everybody. So Jesus is now sitting up on these steps. And John gives us a little bit of a setting here. And he says it was the day of preparation, right, of the Passover. And what he's meaning is it's the day before the Sabbath day during the Passover celebration. So the Sabbath day is already holy, but during the Passover celebration, it's a big Sabbath day. And the day of preparation is the day before, the Friday before. And in the Jewish faith, again, their day started at sunset. So John says, well, it's about 6 hours. It's around there. And Mark tells us it's around the 3rd hour, which is about 9 a.m., and John is saying, well, it's about 12 p.m., or it's about noon. So it's somewhere right before noon. So what he's saying is time's getting short, and the Jews are getting more desperate because they want this thing finished. They want it over with, and they don't have much time here because crucifixion took a while. So they start even pushing harder, right? And they cry out. And they say, away with him and crucify him, right? And Pilate says, shall I crucify your king? What are you talking about? This shouldn't be something that you want. And then the Jewish leaders, the chief priests, say something absolutely shocking here, okay? They say at the end of verse 15, they say, "We have no king but Caesar." Do you see what they're doing here? They're abandoning everything they stood for in their quest to get Jesus killed. They're even aligning themselves with Rome. Now, if you remember the religious leaders, right? The people were getting oppressed by the Romans, and the religious leaders said, "We have God. We'll fight for you. Don't worry. We will always fight against the Romans, and we will always seek God, and we will never bow to the Romans, so we've got your back." Right? And then they see Jesus, and they see it as a threat to their power and control and the people following them. So they want to get rid of Jesus, but they can't get rid of Jesus. So here's what they resort to, which makes no sense. They abandon everything they believe in. And they basically turn their back on God, and they say, "Our allegiance isn't to God, it's to Caesar. It's to Rome." Now imagine the people hearing this. What the religious leaders are trying to protect, they lose right here. They lose all their credibility before the people because they turn on what? But this is in their lust for getting Jesus crucified and their hatred of Jesus. And they're just not making sense. They're trying everything they can to get their way, that they abandon everything and don't make sense. Have you ever been there? Have you ever done that when you're rebelling against God? And you find yourself, because you want your way, you even go against the things that you believe, and you just make no sense, and you go against all those things. Well, at this, Pilate then gives up, and he hands Jesus over to be crucified. Jesus' fate is sealed. And this is the trial of Jesus. But I want you to note, again, all the manipulation that's happening here, right? Pilate's trying to get his way, and the Jews are trying to get their way, or what they desire. And they're both contradicting themselves and getting desperate to get what they desire. Pilate keeps contradicting himself, saying, "Well, I have the authority," but then he keeps passing it off to other authorities so that he can be blameless. But yet he says, "But I'm the one who makes the..." So he's just trying to get away from all of that, right? And the Jews, they're just a mess, right? Because they're saying Jesus is a king, but then they're saying, no, he's the Son of God. Then they're saying, no, but now he's a king again, and he's against Caesar, and we want to follow Caesar. Basically, we're not following God anymore. We want to follow Caesar. That's who we want to obey. And as you kind of look at this passage, maybe you're tempted to say that all this manipulation worked of a situation. It worked, right? The Jews get what they want, and Pilate kind of gets what he wants because he's not solely to blame. He can blame the Jews. Even though he's not blameless, he can say the Jews were worse. So I had to do what I could do. And they both kind of look like they get their way. And is that really what this trial of Jesus is about? No, not at all. You see, while it may look like this trial is a defeat for God and a win for man, actually, this final stage of a trial is a statement and a win for God's sovereignty over man's sovereignty. It's a display of God's rule and his reign and his control over every situation, even something like this, over what man's doing. You see, while Pilate tried every way to avoid Jesus being crucified, in the end, Pilate shows himself powerless, doesn't he? He tried everything, but yet he still ends up having Jesus crucified. He's powerless to stop it. While the Jews appear to get their way, they sacrifice their faith and their integrity, proving themselves powerless on their own. They have to use manipulation and then lose everything they thought they were. In contrast to this, what happens and what will happen with Jesus now in these coming hours is precisely what God had planned all along. It's what needs to take place for redemption, right? All of this is going exactly as God has ordained it to go. It's his work. It's not about their schemes. In fact, as Jesus is presented as Passover before the people, right? We see this in this trial. And here's a few ways that we see God reigning over this, and we see God's hand in this, and how it's exactly his plan. First of all, we see when Pilate, brings Jesus before the people, right? And he's all beaten and all of these things, and he's whipped and all of this. He says, "Behold the man." Now that may sound a little familiar to you, because do you remember the first time Jesus was seen by John the Baptist back in John chapter 129? Do you know what John the Baptist says? "Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world." You see, Pilate takes it his way. This is just a man. We have God's way. Behold the Lamb. And again, it's right at Passover. Jesus is the perfect Passover lamb. And that's kind of how God is painting him and saying, this is what it's all about. And then we also have this. Through this trial, here's what we see. No one is blameless. Not one person is blameless. Okay? Pilate will take blame, right? Jesus said, "Hey, you're going to take blame for this." And he says also, the Jews, "Well, you take blame for this even worse, because you should know better." No one is blameless. What does God's word say? All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All, everyone. You see, the Jews are the Jews, and Pilate represents the Romans or the Gentiles. These are a representation of everybody. Everybody has blood on their hands. And God says, this is the way it needs to be. Everybody takes blame for Jesus being on this cross. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We have a hymn that we sing sometimes, a song. We sing, "How Deep the Father's Love for Me." You know that song? And one of the lines in that song is, "It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished." You got that? Here God's saying, see, even in this trial, I'm displaying this, that everyone is to blame for Jesus being on the cross. It's us. The reason of this. And then you have the mocking and the whipping. This even was according to God's word. Over the cause of the people or Pilate, and the crucifixion will bring life and healing and redemption. You see, all of this will be the beginning of life, not the end of a life. The Jews are thinking this is going to settle it. Pilate thinks this is going to settle it. It's going to be gone. God says, oh no, this doesn't settle it. This starts it. This makes a brand new day will dawn. Because it will be now redemption and healing. It will be accomplished. In fact, I want you to listen to the words of Isaiah as we're looking at all of this and looking at the trial of Jesus and what's happening and what's about to happen to him on the cross. I want you to listen to the words of how the words of Isaiah are fulfilled here. In relation to the cross and his resurrection and what he's going through in this trial. Here's what Isaiah 53 says. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Again, we all have blood on our hands. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb, Passover lamb, that is led to slaughter, and like sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of the people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. He wasn't trying to manipulate. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days, and the will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. And he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death, and he was numbered with transgressors. He took on our sin, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for transgressions. Isn't that wild? That's a picture of what's happening right here. And God says, this is how I planned it. This is my will. This is going to happen exactly as I put it out. Why? Because God is sovereign. He is in control. He is in control, and he has authority over the way he works and the works that he does. He is sovereign in complete control in this situation. And you know what? This same God is sovereign in our lives today. Just as God is sovereign here, he's sovereign in our lives. And we can try to manipulate him to get our way, and we can try to do all these things, or things can go and they look like a defeat. God is still working, and he is sovereign in these, and what is happening and what we are going through is exactly what he wills or allows for us, because he's in control and he rules and reigns. And sometimes we might not like or understand God's ways, but I'll tell you this, they're always best and they're always right, because God is always good and he's always in control. Remember, we talked about that. He's always good, consistently good last week. In fact, what we learned through this final stage in Jesus' trial is that not only is his word and his kingdom our authority, but so are his ways. They're authoritative. His ways go. So how are they trustworthy? Well, as we kind of close this morning, I want to quickly offer you 3 reasons that we can trust God's ways. Not only as we look at our passage, but also how we can trust him in our lives today. So real quickly, God's ways are trustworthy because his works are, first of all, God's works are redemptive. Everything God does is to draw us closer to him. Did you know that? Now, as we look at our passage, we look at Pilate, right? And we look at the Jews. All they did was for their own protection, wasn't it? The Jews worked by whatever means they saw fit, right or, as we see, mostly wrong, to get what they wanted, their power. And we see Pilate doing the same thing, right? And he's trying to work for his own protection and on himself. In contrast, all God does is designed to draw us to him. It's for us to know him, right? To reconcile us to him. His work is designed not to destroy or divide, but to heal and bring peace through him alone. His goodness, good things that we see of God and we see him working in our lives, well, they help show his faithfulness to us, and they help encourage us. When we face discipline for what we've done that's wrong, they're designed, when God disciplines, it's designed for us to seek him for forgiveness. And when we face trials and challenges and they're given to us or they're allowed by God, they're so that we can realize our dependence on him. That we're not in control, but he is, and we can cling to him. God is working to draw us to him. In fact, this is what Peter talks about in one of his letters. He says, the Lord is not slow in to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but he's patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. You know what Peter's saying? God's always working. You may not think he's always working, but he's always working. And he's always working for this reason, to bring us to him and to draw us closer to him. All that happened and was happening to Jesus, while it may have seemed unjust and unfair, it was meant to bring Jesus to the cross, where the final payment for sin was to be made. So we're not only forgiven, but we're also brought close in a relationship with God again. Through this ugly trial, God is working his redemption. And we get to see his son and his worth through all of this. And you know, in the same way, God works in and through us as well. God sovereignly works. God brings people into your life to share the gospel with you. That's how you came to Christ. He brings people into our path who know him and speak of him, and he uses us to proclaim his kingdom and his gospel, and that people can be reconciled to him. And he shows us his blessings so that we can see his love for us. He allows pain in our life and heartache in our life, not to be mean, but he wants to reveal our need for him and our inability to be complete in and of ourselves, but that he wants to be that for us. He wants to walk through us with those situations with us so that we cling to him in those situations. You see, God works in, through, and around us so that we can know him and so we can be with him. Now, not only are God's works redemptive, but we also find him trustworthy another way, because his works are also unchanging. This is why we can trust what God does, is because God's work never changes and his ways never change. In sharp contrast, this is in sharp contrast to Pilate, right? And the Jews who tried to manipulate their end desire by trying every often contradictory angle. They're flip-flopping so many times, they would have made a pancake look flat, right? They keep flip-flopping. When one way didn't work, they change their approach and they try again. And we see Pilate doing this every which way. We see the Jews doing this. First he's a king, then he's the Son of God. Then they say, well, Caesar's going to get you. And then they say, well, we serve Caesar. What do you mean? We're on your team. Right? What is that from The Art of War? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. They're trying everything here, right? To get their way. And what they're showing is they have no foundation and nothing. They're powerless. And they sacrifice, the Jews even sacrifice what they're all about and what's important to them to get their way. And Pilate, for his part, despite what he believed, he still convicts and sentences Jesus, showing great weakness. God isn't like this. His will, his ways, and his works, they're his own. Another way of saying that is God is independent. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need our counsel or our advice for how he should work. He doesn't take that into consideration and say, I can't do this unless somebody tells me to do this. God's the one who says that. He's independent in the way he works, and he doesn't need anybody's help in that. He's got it all figured out because he's over all of it. He's not affected by mob rule or changing opinions or even things that seem to not be going his way. He's not knocked off by that. And that's why I always tell people sometimes when things don't go like we want or tragedies happen, I always remind people, but Jesus is still on his throne. He's still in charge. Even though things look crazy here, he's not taken back by this. God's ways and his works, they stand. They're always right, and they are always true. In fact, his truth and standards and principles in his word, they don't change. They don't change with the times or don't change with the culture. We see that a lot today, don't we? People look at the Bible and they say, well, we need to update what the Bible means to our culture today. See, it didn't have these kinds of situations. So let's kind of twist. God is unchanging, and his word is unchanging. So the truth in his word never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The writer of Hebrews says it like this. So when God desired to show more convincingly to his heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. And here's the oath. So that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie. He says, first of all, he gives this oath, and it's impossible for him to lie. And he gives this oath, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope that is set before us. So God says, I'm unchangeable so that you know when I say something, it's truth, and you can have hope in it. And that's what he's saying here. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain or into God's presence. And we have that because he's unchanging and we can count on him. When Jesus says he loves us, he does. When he says that he will be with us, he will be. When he says that we're sinners in need of a Savior, we are. And there's one way, through him. And this gives us an anchor to hold on to because he is consistent, even when we're inconsistent. He is true. to what he says and in what he does. His ways are always best, and they always lead to life. And we can rest in him and have our hope in him. And you know, this unchanging nature of God's work, it leads us to a final reason that we can trust his ways. You see, in addition to being redemptive and unchanging, his works are therefore dependable. God's works are dependable. If he says he will do something, he will. There is no doubt and there is no variation in it. We can take it to the bank. We can trust in it. Just as despite all the chaos surrounding Jesus, what God ordained to happen is exactly what happens. Exactly the way it needed to happen. And in the same way, God is faithful, and we can depend on him to will and to work just as he plans and ordains to in our lives. So we can trust him. We can depend on him because his works are dependable. In fact, in Psalms it says, "For the word of the Lord is upright, and all of his work is done in faithfulness." Everything God does is faithful and true. When God says that when we confess our sins, that we'll be forgiven, we will be. When he tells us that when we trust in Jesus alone and his work, we'll be saved, we will be. When he says, like Paul says in Philippians, "I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion until the day of Jesus Christ," then we can depend on God to be working in and around us. That God will always be working just as he says he will, in and through our lives. And we can depend on that. So even those times where we feel far away from God, or we say, God's not doing anything, we can depend on this fact that God is working, and he's working to accomplish his will in our lives and through our lives. God is dependable. So, as we wrap this trial together, this is this last part of the trial of Jesus. And again, it teaches us not about the power of man, but the power of God. Not about how man can get what they want, but how God always gets what he wants. He is trustworthy because he always accomplishes what he desires. Just as God works in and through Jesus, he works in and through us to draw us to himself, as we said, to anchor us so that we can rest in him, and to faithfully work so we can rely on him rather than relying on ourselves. You see, if we were to kind of sum this up in one statement, again, you know, we always like to do one statement to kind of remember it by. Here it is. God never wastes his work on that which doesn't matter. Do you know that? God never wastes his work on that which doesn't matter. Another way of saying this is, if God does something, then it matters. He never does anything just to do it. He does it because it matters, and it's his will, and it's his way. When God works in our lives, he does it for his and our best, so that we can accomplish all he desires, so that we can know, and so that we can be changed by him. So even in this trial of Jesus, and we look at it and say, I don't like looking at this because Jesus is made to look weak, and all of these people are triumphing over Jesus. No, they're not. Again, when we started this trial, with this whole passion, we said the passion of Jesus Christ displays all of sin, all of man's rebellion in one little picture, that we can see it in full force, so that we know when Jesus goes to the cross, this is what he's paying for. And we even see our futile attempts to have control over God and to do things our way. But yet God says, nope, it's my way. And I will always accomplish it, and I will accomplish it for my good and your good and our good, because God is sovereign. So God's ways are trustworthy. Let's pray.